5.1 was released last summer, less than a year ago. There were some changes and updates from version 5.0. It's more than just advanced authentication, even though that's what most organizations are focused on. It's more than just any hardware, software, point product that's being advertised will help you become compliant. And as we just recently learned, there'll be an updated version which will incorporate probably the mobile device addendum and the cloud computing, I would imagine, will be incorporated into the update that will be forthcoming. Okay, this is straight from Leslie's notes. And she can jump in any time if she feels I'm happy. It's pretty bad. It's going to be addressed, the policy is going to be revised. It's going to address tablets, smartphones.
Being serenaded.
I think the big takeaway from these audits is RMS. RMS. It seems to be a point of focus for at least their auditor, and I think that one of the beaches, it was reviewed to the point that they're looking at records to see whether or not you have CJI in there, and if so, then it's in scope. I think it would be safe to say that, unless you're certain that there is no data in there in CJI, that you probably ought to place it in scope anyway.
Yeah, I would say so. The auditor we had was fixated. He said, I can tell you 99.9% sure that you've got data in your RMS right off the bat. But we have a jail, and we have federal inmates in our jail, and we put their federal ID number in their record. So, of course, we knew kind of that ours was going to be in scope. But the other thing I'd say about systems that I didn't put up here, but RMS is just one example of where you might have federal data. He asked us also about email. Well, our written policy says you cannot use email for the transmit of CJI, which exempted us from a lot of scrutiny. If we had not had the policy that says no, then our whole email system has to be protected just like the other systems. So I think the thing is, where is the CJI? You talked about follow the data. Anywhere that you might have that is subject to the policy, whether it's email, whether it's a USB drive, whether it's a file share, and RMS really, our auditor came in knowing that that was going to be a state until proven otherwise, right?
So I think that's an excellent point, just to call that out, is that emails, you can use email. Email is allowed, it's just you have to have things in place. But doing nothing could possibly bring it in scope, but by having a policy that says it's not authorized, it sounds like that removed it from the scope of the audit. And it's my experience that many organizations have informal but effective policies, if you want to call it that. They don't allow it, but it's not written. And so this would kind of speak to, you need to review your policy document set and make sure you're covering the finer points so that you can...
We had to provide copies to the auditor of the written documents, so we took those with him. So it wasn't enough for us to say we had one, we had to produce the document for the audit.
And even the SBI got hit on that. Josh Hickman had emailed me after Leslie's email went out and said that they did not document in policy that they do annual verification of user accounts for DCI. Do it, but they didn't document the policy. Yeah.
And one along those lines, Shannon, with the user IDs, one other recommendation we got, we have to come up with a mechanism for authenticating the user who they say they are.
Oh, yeah, that
Password
was
resets.
Password resets.
Yeah, that was one thing. I'm not sure. I put it in the email I sent. Is the guy asked us, well, if an officer calls in to get his password reset, how do you know he is who he says he is? And we thought, wow, that's a really good question.
Good question.
So I don't think he dinged us on that, but told us that we needed to come up with a method. And it could be as simple as finding a field in our Active Directory where everybody could give us a password, a passphrase or something that they tell us when they call us.
Mama's maiden name.
Or any of that. It could be just as simple as that. But some other piece of information that they needed to give us when they called in for a password reset.
I don't think you do those,
because I mean, I know password unlock.
Can you talk louder, Randy, or do you want me to bring the microphone around?
No, I'll just talk. No, my phone's fine. I was just curious, if you do password unlocks, I guess you wouldn't fall into that because you would just be unlocking it. You know, so you really wouldn't follow the scope. And I just throwing this out there, just thinking about what you're saying about resets and what we may do, because I know Ray and I, we talked about, and I don't know if you could do this, but what you said, I just changed it to your initials and your social. I mean, something they probably already know.
Anything
but you have
that
to have
has
a
a
policy.
piece of information in it that only they would know, like if you reset it to their initials and their employee ID, would be fine, because that's a piece of information. But if you're gonna tell them your new password is 12345, then you've got to do something, to know that that is who they say they are.
That's an excellent point.
Everybody heard that? I know some of you in the back are probably hearing that side more.
We didn't get dinged on it, because that piece is new, it's part of a new policy, so he put us in compliance, but he wrote new
Okay.
validation process document.
And
We need to
truthfully,
do it.
that's a best practice in just about any industry when it comes to password resets, or resetting it to something that they would only know is probably it's going to become a preferred method for many of you that may have challenges doing identification, verification. And one thing I would say, if you haven't done this already, you can do this on your own as an entity. You could use a third party. You don't need to. But I think it would be helpful, and I think that New Hanover County and City of Wilmington and Town of Cary and Rowan County and others may agree that if you get all the stakeholders in a room and go through the policy in whatever manner you choose, that you may come to understand some things about your organization that you weren't necessarily aware of, or you may come to find out that certain things are happening that are kind of deviating from what you thought was occurring. So it can kind of help you get your house in order before you start revising or creating and drafting new policy standards and procedures. I think it's a worthwhile exercise. It shouldn't take too long. And if you have any questions, you can always throw them out there on listserv. And those who have already been through something like that could explain or help clear up some of the unclear requirements of standards.
I'm going to insert something here. If it would be useful, which I think it would be useful, if folks have those kinds of policies, we have a landing page for the CJIS workshop that we did back in March that I maintained. It would make a lot of sense to put those policies there, or under the Nickel-G's of membership, where you member only log in. I could go in and redact the name of the organization if you wanted me to. But if you want to send those to me, I would be happy to put those in a place that we could then access them, because a lot of you are replicating policies. I think it was Joel that asked me if there was a master access control or whatever it was. So it would be great to have some sort of standard that we're all operating from.
The other thing I'll say about policies is there are some policies that have to be under the jurisdiction of the law enforcement agency that are beyond IT policies, right? So the IT security policy, there were some things he looked at that were part of our county IT policy. He said, yeah, but the sheriff needs this, right? So like media protection policy was one of them. We had one on digital media protection, but they wanted to see a more all-encompassing media protection policy that included the papers, the fact that they shredded paper, and those kinds of things. It was part of the law enforcement agency. Physical protection from a physical building security perspective, that's not something we're going to write for them, but it was in scope of this audit, like whether you check IDs at the door, who you allow in unescorted, who you escort. That's not ours to do as IT people, but it is in scope of the audit. And our folks really, without us pointing it out to them, really wouldn't have realized that they even needed those things.
That's a good point. Some of the actual law enforcement agencies inside of your local government may not be aware of what they need to have in place, both from a technical standpoint and a policy standard procedures standpoint. Advanced authentication. Leslie, your notes indicated that if you cannot determine the location of the MDT or MDC for some of you, that you must use advanced authentication. So to be clear, because there's a lot of confusion here, the guidance that Nickel Giza and the state have been providing is that if you take the MDT, the laptop, out of the vehicle, then advanced authentication is required. Is that consistent with what you experienced?
We did. The advanced authentication extension, if you will, was only an extension of the car as a secure location. And there is some discussion, some of you may have heard, that we're never going to need AA. They're talking about doing away with AA. The discussion among the federal government group that does CJIS is talking about making the patrol car a secure location forever, right? So if your MDT never can access CJI outside of the squad car, then you wouldn't need AA on that device.
Possibly, if they approve,
Like
Right.
if it was mounted, is that what you're?
like hard mounted, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah, in the car.
Q-locked.
Yeah, in the car. That, if you think about it, is practical maybe for a patrol guy, not so practical maybe for a detective or some other person, right? So you have to think about those things. Also, we've had lots of requests for where are we going with tablet computers, right? When are we going to be able to use an iPad to get to this and that and the other thing? So you may defer, for a while, but I think AA is going to be a requirement for these things in the future. Smartphones, we were talking about with the federal agent that there is a little portable APHIS app for the iPhone, right? So they're looking at how a guy can take his iPhone and scan a fingerprint from the field and run it through APHIS. Well, APHIS is a federal system, so guess what? You got to do advanced authentication on the little iPhone, because that's a mobile device. But the AA is really, if you can't tell that the laptop is in squad car number 123 or in office number 105, if you don't know if that thing can move around and still access data, then you need AA. That's pretty much the easiest way.
One thing that I found out about AA, which I didn't know, is, let's say if it's myself or Helen, if we take our laptops home and we may be working on the system, so that our laptops we have to have AA for.
As a support person.
Oh,
Y'all hear that?
with administrative access to this,
Yes.
the systems that contain
So
CJI.
as a tech, you have to have AA if you have the access from any location, if not a secure location,
Right, you have to have AA.
remote, home, sitting
Here.
at Nickel Giza.
Right.
But most techs can't get access or user ID password for the CJIS card.
But
I mean, like
But-
online, you have Vision Mobile loaded, but I can't get to the police side to run the tags. I just can log into Vision Mobile. I can't pass it through.
But does your records management system, do you support records management?
Yes.
Does it store CJI? If it does, then yes, you have application level access to that data.
and-
I don't have DCI access either, but because I support the application that stores the data, I have to have advanced authentication.
And if you have
'Cause you can
internet
see
or
the data.
e-server-
Yeah,
Correct.
you could go in the back end. You got to remember, they're talking about people who have what they consider to be network level access to the systems that store CJI. So I could theoretically put a little sniffer in and look at the data as a support person. I could log into SQL and go in the back way and get into the data. You got to protect those methods too, not just through the message switch kind of access that you're talking about there with DCI credentials.
And I can tell you, if you're running an OSSI message switch, you have access to that guy, you actually have a lot more access than you think. It may not be what you think you have access to, but if that data were in somebody else's hands, the username and password to DCI, because it proxies the request through, just so you know. So that is a very important thing, that message above and beyond.
Along with that, the Southern Software message switch, if you look at the logs, you can see the returns from their DCI queries in plain text also.
2014.
As long as they remain.
As long as you never remove the laptop from the car.
And that can be a written
And
policy.
as long as you have, what about the update to the software? Is that one?
This is 2005.
That is not extended, I mean, if you've upgraded.
If you've upgraded your software since 2005, and the way they define that is either new software or at 25% of the total cost of the project, then you have to have AA.
And that is a question, I think, on one of the questionnaires about have you done the upgrade?
Yeah.
Or have you upgraded?
So we specifically asked that question to our FBI agent and Josh Hickman was in the room as well. And our agent said that while that is in the CJIS standard, it's not something being enforced at the federal level. So.
That's interesting because 3 years ago, somebody got dinged on that.
Rex did,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What was
Yeah,
that?
Rex got dinged on that.
I think that, and maybe we're gonna get to that eventually, but each agent is gonna be different
Yes.
when they come to audit. The mileage may vary.
So that's a good point. The guidance that has been received by the official chain, which would be Josh, when he posed the question that Shannon asked to the FBI, the return on that is what Shannon just described. That if it's been procured or updated since 2005, or what did you say, Shannon?
25% or more of the total cost is the way they define that.
Then the extension does not apply to you. And that was the official guidance from North Carolina SBI, based on the guidance they received from the FBI. But the auditor that you're talking to may not be in the loop with that whole chain. So there seems to be some inconsistency, is what we seem to be hearing here. But all we know to go on is what.
Whenever they're playing music.
Okay, I gotta.
But does that answer your question? It's a good one. It's a good one. So what the information I have from our state is that it's not likely the extension applies to most organizations.
Right, because, I would assume 95% of agencies that operate
But it's a good question to ask. And, if they're not enforcing it, you can roll the dice. But again, the state's going to come through anyway at some point. So, application level logging and host logging are also something to consider that are often overlooked, as well as media protection, physical protection, and acceptable use policies. Those were looked at too heavily. So these are kind of the nuggets that Leslie put out there after their review.
We skipped over the encryption, but I think if you think about this whole concept of secure locations, the FBI guy that we had was sort of wrapped around this idea that buildings are secure, cars are secure, but everywhere else is not. So what he fixated on with us a little bit on our network diagram was our RMS server is out at the sheriff's detention facility. We have records clerks downtown who access that system, right? We have guys that run MDTs while they're sitting at their desk at the sheriff's office and the message switch is at the 911 center, right? And they're using the wired connection. So the way he interpreted the policy was when the wire leaves the building, the secure location, we got to encrypt until it gets to the other secure location in the building. So that was his read.
Your network admins encrypting that or your software provider?
Well, we got dinged on that.
We
That
got
was our
dinged on
one technical thing, because we actually own a lot of our own fiber. So a lot of that's private fiber behind our firewall. The other is Metro E from AT&T. So those are the two scenarios we had for building to building links. Both of them, based on the audit, are required to be encrypted. So we're looking at, little firewalls.
So to be clear, privately owned fiber, New Hanover County secured facility to another New Hanover County secured facility, your auditor says that needs to be encrypted.
Yeah, and I said, is it because it's on the poles? Could we put it underground? What's your definition? He said, no. He said, doesn't matter. Underground, on the poles, doesn't matter. When it leaves the secure facility, encrypted.
And
That's interesting.
Even if it's VPN times that.
Well, no, if it's VPN, then it's encrypted, right?
But the links between the buildings have to be encrypted.
That's correct.
Right, into the end
No, you
camera
can
with
use
your own fiber.
application level encryption, you know, if you wanna do like they did with Omnix and put a little VPN on the back end of the application, you can do it that way. Or you can encrypt, you know, all the traffic from the server out, or however you wanna do it.
Ray, he even said that to be truly in compliance, we should encrypt the fiber between buildings on the sheriff's office complex. We have multiple buildings out there and we have fiber between the buildings. He said, you know, because it is a closed campus, we're okay with that. He said, but realistically, on campus, it should be encrypted between buildings also, not just between locations.
Can I ask a question? When he fixated on this, did he get into the encryption being FIPS 140-2?
Yes. Same standard as all the other
And I
encryption.
just want to see how far he went. So I'm just curious, did he get into looking for your tamper-proof seals on your FIPS 140-2? I'm curious. I mean, it's like if you're fixated on one thing, it seems like you ride it all the way down.
No, and,
I agree.
and Carrie, you guys didn't get dinged on that, did you?
They mentioned it as an issue, but
Not at all. And you had the same guy we did.
And Ray, on Randy's comment, he said to us at one point, at one of the audits I sat in, at one point he said, you can tell me you're doing this all you want. He said, you could lie to me all you want. He said, but it's on you if something goes wrong. He said, I'm not going to go inspect every little piece of this, but if something goes wrong, it's in your best interest to be upfront and honest with this. Because
Yeah,
a
of
couple of
course.
people had questions like, well, I'm not sure. So he was, you know, if you've got the policies and you know what you're talking about, and he's taking you, our auditor took us at our word for a whole lot of things.
Okay, but to Randy's point, if they're not actually, it doesn't sound like that individual necessarily understood all the criteria for FIPS 140-2. You know, with the, we've already talked about this.
Yeah.
Interesting. That's an interesting take on it. I would hope to see in the future that perhaps that position might change a little bit, but it is what it is. So that's pretty much the update from the recent audits. Is there anything and we're going to go through real quick kind of each of the policy areas and just kind of talk about some of the key items for each one. This is just kind of an overview right here. Any questions on this before I move forward? Or did we omit anything? Okay. Okay, so the policy requirements we're going to review go anywhere from information exchange agreements all the way down to personnel security, all of them essentially. This is just a generic view of a network that has the components that are pretty much the same across the board when it comes to accessing these.
Oh, I should have mentioned one other thing.
Yes.
I did not put this, I don't think, in my little note that I did, but he also had one of our network administrators log into the firewall, our top of the network firewall, and show him different policy sets. So we had to show that our network administrator understood about access control lists, and we had ACLs in place, and that we were conversant on the firewall. I should have mentioned that. So that was another thing. Did he do that to y'all too?
He did that to me as well. But when I showed him my config, he was like, I don't understand any of that.
You showed him the text config with the ASA, not the GUI?
Yeah, I showed him my big ASA config.
Like the actual run?
About 10 pages long. He was like,
okay.
I think what he was looking for was the fact that we use things like ACLs, that we had net, we had those kinds of things going on. He's not an IT person, he's a federal agent, right? So he's got his checklist, and he just wants to hear the terms, and get an overview of the fact that you at least know how to log into your firewall and show them what an ACL is, right?
because I just pulled up a backup config file that we did the night before. I was like, well, here it is. It wasn't even alive.
That's a good point. So some of the things that we're going to talk about as well, are we've already talked about advanced authentication, encryption at the endpoints, auditing, and policies. These aren't the only things that are important, but there's some that are often overlooked. So policy area 1 is information exchange agreement. Scenario, I use a third-party vendor to manage or host my network email servers. What are my responsibilities and requirements to ensure CJIS compliance? So, and I'm interested to see if they review these as well.
Yes, they wanted copies.
Okay, so all employees with access or potential access to CJI must have be fingerprinted, have criminal history run, and data must be maintained locally by the agency. Vendor has to sign a security addendum. Vendor employees and local staff undergo CJIS required security awareness training. Management control agreement must be established between the law enforcement agency and the third-party vendor company. Whoever is authorized to make those agreements. And if IT outsourcing if IT is outsourcing specific functions, then the IT agency head and contractor can sign the management control agreement.
Ray, along those lines,
Yes.
not only do you need the management control agreement with the head of the company, for some third-party vendors, all of their employees must individually sign a security addendum along with undergoing the training.
And they have to all be fingerprinted as well?
Yes.
Fingerprinted background check.
I thought a security addendum management control at the, management level was sufficient, but anyone who works for them that works with you on your systems must also sign a security addendum.
I will say we had a little sidebar conversation with the agent and with the SBI person that was there, who was one of their auditors and trainers, about how much easier it would be if the state would vet these vendors for us and manage that, especially the security awareness training and the fingerprints and background checks. I can understand that we need to do the security addendum, signing it with us in the company because we let them on our systems. But for all of us to have to maintain this record keeping for the same vendors over and over again, it's nuts. And the federal agents said different states do it different ways, right? So if the state would step up, and maybe we need to lobby them hard to say, the Southern softwares, the OSSIs are vetted by the SBI.
And, I brought that up with the state, and I get the sense that that's not going to
Happen.
because of the funding and a full-time employee to do that. He just said they're not set up for it, but I know, is it Texas or someone else? Some other states do have a process like that.
Yes, other states do, and my thing to them was, and I said it early on about things like the AA. If they would take on pieces of that, they charge us so much per TID right now. Add $1 or $2 to the TID fee and get it done for us, because that would be a way that they could fund a position to take care of it, that nobody would get hit overly hard.
That's a good point. They kind of spread load the whole cost. Easy to absorb.
We're already used to paying that.
Let me ask a question here. So if you have a vendor like an OSSI or a Southern Software, all of their technicians that handle the state of North Carolina have to be fingerprinted at each individual agency and background check, and they have to go through security training, awareness training for each individual agency they support.
If you use a separate security awareness training than the state does, like we use the state security awareness training, so those people can sign saying, I've seen that, right? And if you have the same thing, they don't have to view it multiple times because we use the same security awareness training. We use the one that the SBI provides for all of our folks. The other thing we did with, we at the county level provide support to, Wrightsville Beach, Carolina Beach, Curry Beach, Wilmington. They all come through our message switch. So actually Josh Hickman helped us with this. We were going to have to send our folks back to get fingerprinted again for, third or fourth time, because if the terminal operator doesn't select all of those agencies when he submits the prints, then the background checks don't get run for them. So, and I'll get to that now, but what we did, we had cards. We had physical cards printed from the time before, so he allowed us, Josh did, to put little stickers on them with the different ORIs for the agencies and send them up to the state, and they ran them for each of the agencies we support. What the agency really needs is not the physical card with the fingerprints on it, but the letters of fulfillment that come back from the SBI that you've got a clean background check. So you don't have to be fingerprinted, 5, 6, 7 times for the different submit the cards for all the ORIs that are needed, so OSSI can do the same thing, really.
Correct.
So
We
could
sent 150 cards.
So could we request letters of fulfillment from OSSI?
It has to be done. You know, the thing is, the letter of fulfillment is supposed to be to the agency. That's what I
So it's unique,
understand,
yeah.
so it's a unique, it's got their name on it.
So you could get, realistically, you get permission from OSI to use the cards that we have and put your ORI on them and send them all up to the state. Still scan them in and send you the letter of fulfillment.
But I think still, if there were some,
Yeah, broad level.
Does that answer your question? This is very cumbersome and taxing, and I would encourage, those that can, to make a little noise about this. Because I think at the end of the day, this is it's a lot of duplication of efforts across the state. It's unnecessary, but it is what it is, and it's the way it is right now, but it doesn't mean it can't change. And I think this would be much easier to change than perhaps getting the state to roll out two-factor authentication to everybody.
exactly, the record-keeping piece would be easier.
And they're well suited to do it anyway. But that was an excellent question you asked, and that one comes up a lot. Policy Area 2, Security Awareness Training. Pretty straightforward, the criteria is there. There's training for everyone. There's training for individuals with access to CJI. And then there's additional training requirements for those that have administrative access to those systems that process, store, CJI. Any dings on this for anybody that's been audited?
I think the bottom line for us was if you're using the state's security awareness training, you're okay. If you make your own, they're gonna probably check it and see.
And I will also say that even though we were present at the audit, he was addressing these types of questions to the TAC at the agency, at the sheriff's office, not IT.
Not you.
The TAC and the agency is responsible and needs to be able to answer these questions.
For the record keeping.
For the record keeping.
That's an excellent
We
point.
helped as much as we could and kind of helped guide them some, but he was addressing these questions to the TAC and to the agency, not to IT, in this section.
Keep your records and have a documented policy on disposal procedures. And I just throw that in there because it comes up in that section about covering those types of things in security awareness training. I've also reviewed the state video. I know it's being recorded now or being reviewed or updated. It covers most of the actual requirements, but it misses a few. It probably wouldn't hurt to throw in some other additional training about mobile media and some other things which are probably required anyway here with the update to be released soon. Incident response. What's important here is to understand what's reportable to the state ISO. We asked that question in March. We posed it this way, if I have an MDT with a virus, is that something that we need to report up through the state? And the response was, not if it's, a unique event or an anomaly, but if you had an outbreak or something, or you discovered a keylogger, or data was being exfiltrated from your system, then that would be a reportable event. You need to have policy around this. You need to have some, incident response plan. I would encourage you to consider doing some testing, not just for, even though we're talking about CGI here, but for your entire environment. It would be worthwhile. If you're handling credit cards, it's a requirement of that. If you're a county government and you're handling healthcare information, it's a requirement of that anyway. It's likely to be a requirement of some other certifications and accreditations you may be pursuing. Was this addressed in the audit very much, or?
Wanted to make sure we had a policy.
You have a policy.
He took a copy.
Just took a copy of the written policy.
Okay. Auditing and accountability, what events, content, the normal stuff, timestamps, the NCIC and the III transactions are normally handled automatically with the system that you're using. State and federal retention laws may be different. I think Shannon's covered this in detail. And how deep did they go on this part of the review?
He didn't go real deep. The one thing he did say is they preferred at the application level, which a lot of them do. And I think Raquel was going to work with Southern on their reporting and logging. As a fallback, if your application doesn't do it, your Windows logging would be acceptable as long as you're doing it.
So
I think the thing there, we were talking about this morning out at the table, we found out, and we knew this kind of early on looking at AA, the preference would have been for AA to be asserted when you tried to log into the application. application level is where they would like for this login to occur, where they love for password complexity to occur and all those kinds of things. But knowing that's not there, the fallback is to Windows, right? So OSSI doesn't expire passwords, I don't think, or enforce complexity and those kinds of things. So Windows is the fallback. You know, the logging then has to go back to Windows also, because that's where we're enforcing complexity, where passwords are missed, you know, on login and that kind of thing. So if you can't do it at the application, then you fall back.
And are they looking for the logging at the application on the MDTs and or the logs, or the Windows host logs on the MDTs, or are they just looking at the back-end components? Because the policy seems to apply that it's all hosts.
I think
And I know
that,
we've gone back and forth on this.
yeah, I think that he didn't go into detail yet. Basically, yes, we're doing it. We told him how we were doing it, what we were doing it. I actually had sample reports in front of me. Again, it's all preparation. I showed failed logons. I should, you know, so I had those samples there, so he knew we were doing it. I think he's looking for both.
Okay. Well,
You need to be able to track the user from beginning to end. If you can't do it at application, then he wants to see it all the way through.
excellent point. Access control, pretty straightforward, using the principle of least privilege. There's some criteria specific to how many unsuccessful logon attempts are permitted before the system will lock you out or time out. System use notification, session lock, remote access, gets into personally owned information systems, which are permitted. Again, we get back to you need to have some kind of policy that describes what is allowed and what's not allowed. Publicly accessible computers, wireless access restrictions. So all these things fall under policy area 5. I'm interested to understand the session lock with respect to patrol cars.
So in a secure location, I think that's one of the exemptions, right? So
Yes.
So it would be exempt from that.
Okay, but when it comes out of the car, what we've been recommending at this point is to cover by policy that if you take it out of the car, then you must lock it yourself. Is that, or is that just not even in the scope of we're not even covered?
You know, we didn't talk about session lock, but I would think you would have to have the 30 minutes, which is the maximum required if you were out of the car. And maybe Randy can talk technically this afternoon more about how to do some of that. We do it through Active Directory, but the policy also says if they leave it, they control all the leak lock.
That's your policy, that's your county policy?
I think it's in the policy.
Yeah, it's in the policy.
That you have to manually lock it if you leave it unattended. And then the 30 minutes is the maximum inactivity time.
That's been in the policy forever, and that's
But
enforceable.
and I can't remember whether that is specific to the secure location or whether that's just for everything.
So there's a vehicle exception.
For it.
You talk about officer safety.
Officer safety, that's right. There is an exception where the policy allows for that.
Yeah.
The problem we had, and that's a technical question that we haven't necessarily cared to solve at this point, is, you know, docked versus undocked, those kinds of things. Policy application for the different states that the laptop might be.
Yeah, it says in the interest of officer safety, devices that are part of a police vehicle or used to perform dispatch functions in a secure area are exempt from this requirement. Any discussion during the audit about the personally owned systems?
You need to prohibit them in policy, written policy, or they are in scope.
Okay, that's a good point. Again,
Same thing like with email, you gotta have a written policy.
any questions on policy area 5? Policy area 6 covers authentication and identification. This one we've talked about at length. Password complexity requirements for standard passwords, and then the advanced authentication requirement for access to CJI from a non-secured area. Any questions about this? I think this afternoon, if you want to take a deep dive from the technical standpoint, Randy's going to cover that.
We're gonna talk about it.
It's innovative ways of meeting this requirement and not having to spend a whole lot.
I think the one point, I think everybody in here is beyond this, but we had to explain it, to some of the law enforcement, is the assertion piece. It's not you don't assert your credentials to the device, it has to be to a central database, network-based authentication, because some people believe, that little fingerprint reader that comes on the laptop, that you just say, yeah, I'm me, and it lets you into the laptop, is AA, and it's not. And so you can use fingerprints as a method for authentication, but the database has to be a centrally stored on the server kind of database, not a local assertion of you are who you say you are.
That's a good point. It's not that you can't use this fingerprint reader on the iPad here, or ThinkPad, excuse me, but it has to be tied into a back-end system. We've covered this earlier. All right, policy area 7, configuration management. Principal least privilege or least functionality, network diagram requirement, and there's specific criteria as to what needs to be on the diagram. It doesn't need to be, don't recommend that it is your entire network diagram put forward, but rather just the key pieces and parts with respect to criminal justice information, data flow. And your configuration documentation should be kept away from non-authorized individuals.
Yeah, he asked about our change management
Change management came into place.
policy, the policy procedure process.
Excellent. So here's something, I don't know how much this came up, but this is something that seems to be a trend out there amongst the agencies I've been working with, and it's electronic media, mobile media specifically, like USB drives, thumb drives, flash drives, whatever you want to call them. Some agencies would be well served by just reviewing what's in use at the law enforcement level, and what are they actually doing with these things, and how what's on them, and how's it controlled, and so on and so forth. CJIS aside, it's those small media are responsible for more data breaches, for the amount of records breached than anything else out there. They're not responsible for the most incidents of data breach, but they're responsible for the most number of records breached on an annual basis. This is a Verizon statistic, not Verizon Department of Justice, Secret Service statistic.
I'll say on the thumb drives that we have a written policy that we don't allow them to put CJI on removable media. If that had not been in our written policy, the agent was ready to look at how we encrypted those and how we registered them and stuff. So that was, the auditor was going through yes/no checklist, okay? So he had his guidance, almost like a flow chart. And if we had said, yes, we allow this, it opens up a whole nother set of questions, if you know what I'm talking about. So when we said no, and here it is in our policy, he skipped over like a whole page worth of yes/no questions further down the line. So,
Good point.
yeah.
I'm curious with the others that were audited, what did you have on the media side? How did they go into it?
Same way.
Had policy or, to make sure that,
The only thing we got nothing in that policy, we're just running in that one agency stuff.
Media protection, pretty straightforward here. How you have to have a policy, you have to document it, you have to define procedures for securely handling, transporting, and storing media, mobile media, and physical media. What do you do with sanitizing drives? I think, Corey, you were talking about this specifically this morning, weren't you?
Yeah, because of what we were doing, we got dinged, we were sending like old PCs out to gov deals, and he was saying if we did that, we needed to make sure we scrub them with a DOD approved software package, or take the hard drives out and hit them with a hammer, or shoot them, do anything. He said he didn't care as long as he couldn't get any data off of the hard drive.
Yeah, and the other thing about the media protection policy is what our auditor wanted to see was an all-encompassing media protection policy for the law enforcement, that included, you're talking about this physical media, that's just not electronic, but the paper records as well.
Oh, yeah.
The paper records, so they're shredding, you know, those kinds of things are part of media protection.
One other thing you gotta look for too is at your police departments or sheriff's offices, you got a copy with a hard drive in it. You gotta take that into consideration as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, hard drives in the copiers. Some of you may own yours, or some may have a service. That needs to be something that's considered. Physical protection. This is normally handled very well in most law enforcement organizations, just because it's the nature of what they do. Controlled areas, unescorted access, escorted access for individuals that haven't been cleared, visitors law requirements, which is the state's position to change a little bit in the fall on that. This is pretty straightforward, though.
On the physical protection, going back to the security awareness training and those things, the other thing that I wasn't initially aware of, but it kind of rang a bell before the audit, was we have medical staff in our jail. They have unescorted access to the facility, which means they can walk right by the DCI terminals. That put them within this scope of physical protection, which means they need to be fingerprinted and background checked so they could have unescorted access.
Excellent point. Yeah.
One thing he said about us is like we keep our backup tapes in a safe in collections, and because everybody in collections had that combination, all of them needed to be fingerprinted and go through the security awareness video.
Your tapes aren't encrypted.
Right.
If you encrypt your tapes, that would
Go away.
Go away.
Right.
go away.
We quickly encrypted our tapes before the audit because we knew those things would go away.
So that's an example of using encryption as a buffer, just as like a firewall or an ACL. It can buy you a lot.
What we gonna change over?
This one is the catch-all. This is the Systems and Communications Protection, Information Integrity. Things here, this covers essentially everything from a network security standpoint we haven't already discussed, like encryption for connections, information flow enforcement, IDS, boundary protection, partitioning and virtualization, patch management, malicious, antivirus, anti-malware, personal firewall, and security alerts and advisories. I'm interested, was there any discussion about virtualization?
He asked that question, and again, that's one of those things that if you say yes to, it opens up a whole nother set of questions. Yeah, so if you use virtualization, do you guys in here use that? So he probably had some questions, or she, whoever did your audit, yeah. Because of that, if you use cloud for anything, it opens up a whole other set of questions. So just know the simpler you can keep things, probably the better.
What were those questions? I mean, what did it entail?
Well, for a while I thought you were going to go down the road of having things running on the same hardware, not secrets related. Didn't seem to have a problem with that. And that's hard for us. We have people all over the place all the time. We're going to 5 minutes ago. So that was good. She didn't seem to about that. But just the general concern of separation between not letting applications on the same servers that other agents, on the same virtual server that are
Separating functions.
separating functions out, dedicating your message switch VM to being the message switch is kind of the same thing.
That's excellent. Any other discussion on this? Kind of wrapping it up. I know it's about lunchtime. I just kind of reposted this. If you've been on this or if you've already seen something like this, just to remind everyone that when you submit when you develop or decide on or evaluate a solution for your advanced authentication, not to continue to talk about that one area. Since what we're doing in North Carolina deviates from the letter of the policy, meaning the application is not actually doing advanced authentication unless you're using Southern software, need to have an approved scenario. Brian Dickerson can do it. It just needs to be submitted, so you have it on file. And I don't know, was that even reviewed or?
We had to give a
Give a
copy
copy
of
of it.
this to the agent.
Yeah.
And so the only
And
point
I don't know that he cared that the SBI had reviewed it or not. I think that's something we in the state have done to save ourselves a lot of trouble. You know, before you go and buy and all of that, send it up to the state and they'll say, yeah, this
meets the criteria.
meets the criteria and move forward. It's kind of a good first step for us that we're doing. He didn't ask whether it had been state reviewed, he just wanted a copy of the network.
He wanted this, and he also wanted the more generic overall county network diagram we have.
So basically.
Not just the CJIS network, but the overall
Oh,
network.
excellent. So the entire entire environment, at a high level.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of resources out there within Nicholas GISA. The recommendation here would be just take one that's already been created and change it specific to the solutions you select to implement. And just make sure you have your sequence of events in there, and you're covering all the elements of the scenarios that have been approved, and it really shouldn't be an issue. Any questions on that? So that's really all I had, just kind of a guided discussion. I appreciate everyone participating. It's recently been reviewed, and I look forward to the afternoon session with Randy for the technical discussion. Yeah.